This program is brought to you by House Lens. For more information about House Lens and real estate videos, visit www.houselens.com.
Hello, I'm Chuck Young. Welcome to Eternity Now. Today on our show, we've got a very special guest. Our guest is the pastor at the Lebanon and Old Hickory Boulevard Seventh-day Adventist churches here in Nashville, Tennessee. Pastor Wayne Long. Wayne, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here.
Man, it's such a blessing to have you here on our show. And, you know, we've never met before today, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, you know, where you were raised and just some about your life.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in West Virginia, and I lived the first 22 years of my life there. Met my wife there. We had our first child there. And as things kind of came to be, we ended up moving to Georgia, spent almost 10 years in Georgia. And that is where I sensed my call, became a Christian and sensed my call to ministry. We then moved to Collegedale, Tennessee, so that I could attend school. Was there for 4 years. And then we moved to Berrien Springs, Michigan, so that I could go to seminary. And of all the places that God could send me, He brought me back here to Nashville, Tennessee.
Now, how long have you been back in Nashville?
Since 2011.
2011. Now, along this road that you were traveling, that you were just now explaining to us, what were you doing along the way before you felt like you were led to be a pastor?
Lots of things. You know, I grew up in a household that was not very religious. My mother was a Seventh-day Adventist, but she was very much of a legalist, and so it wasn't a very good role model of what Jesus Christ really was all about. When I was about 8 years old, she just kind of fell out of the church because it was just too much of a burden to try to keep up this whole front of being a Christian. So I really did not have Jesus Christ in my life at all through all of my teens and through most of my 20s. And as a result of that, I got into playing in bands, and I actually was a lead guitar player in a heavy metal band when I was up in West Virginia. Had the hair down to my waist, we played in the clubs, we did all these kind of things.
It's kind of some fun details there. Now, how old were you when you were playing in a band like that?
I believe I was 17 when we first started that particular band. And that went until around 1991, 1992, somewhere around there. But yeah, that was an interesting time, Now, you guys, did you play other people's music, or did you pretty much have your own music when you were doing that? Well, we started off playing, everything was covers. And of course, you know, if you play in a band, you know that covers mean you play other people's stuff. But then we kind of got arrogant. We got kind of proud of our own music, and so we didn't want to be like everyone else. We wanted to play our own stuff. And we would play in places, and they'd say, well, we want you to play such and such. And we said, no, we're going to play our own stuff. And we would argue back and forth, and finally they would see it our way. But it was probably an 80% original, 20% covers. And we were pretty bold back then.
You know, on public TV here, there's a lot of music that people play sometimes. So there's probably a few rockers and ex-rockers out there. What were some of the bands that you guys particularly like to play? Just to name a couple of them.
Well, of course, the band that inspired me to play rock music to begin with was the band Kiss, which is you know, still going on, I think. And but yeah, there were other bands. It seemed as I got older, the music got heavier and harder, darker. I moved from party music like Kiss into kind of the heavier, darker stuff like bands like Metallica, into even darker bands like Slayer, these other kind of things. Which, of course, Slayer was a particularly interesting band in that they had pretty much a demonic kind of gimmick.
Very dark, very dark.
Yes, and they
dark music
that.
and dark lyrics also.
Oh yes, yes.
Now, you know, let me ask you something. You know, being somebody who's from a music background like that, Do you think, and we've actually talked a little bit about it on our show, do you think there is an element of devil worship involved with some of the music that's being played out there today?
I think that it's safe to say that there is. I think that there is probably maybe not as much as many people think. There's been some people who, if it just sounds like a rock song, well, it's the devil, you know, these kind of things. But I think it is safe to say that there is definitely an element of Satan worship in some areas of these things. And some bands will come out there and tell you that that's the driving force.
Well, you know, from some of the study I've done on that, and people can go online and just Google rock and roll music and Satan worship, and you can get some really interesting details about some of these band members and how they have literally sold their soul to the devil for success, and that many of them, they don't even really know where the guitar riffs come from or some of the music that they're playing, because it just sort of starts coming out of them without them really having control of it. And oddly enough, some of those songs become some of the biggest hits of all time. And it's kind of an interesting study. If anybody ever wants to look into that, I think you'd find that very interesting. So how does a guy come out of this heavy metal background to become a stodgy pastor?
Stodgy. Well, you know, it was really an amazing journey, a very interesting journey. It actually started with my mother becoming a Christian again. And once she became a Christian, she was much more balanced. And she would always tell me, she'd say, "Wayne, we're still praying for you." And I'd say, "Oh, I don't need that stuff. It's a crutch." You know, you hear a lot of atheists and agnostics say, "It's a crutch. Opium for the weak," you know, kind of thing, opium for the masses.
Let me ask you this. At that point, did you feel like, well, there is a God, maybe there is a God, a power out there, or were you thinking that there wasn't a God and that it's just pretty much do what you want and live and die, or was it somewhere in between?
It was probably more in between. I was raised in a Christian environment, you know, even though it wasn't a great Christian environment. So I had a sense that there was God and God was there. But I had the sense that he was a detached God. He was not a personal God. He was not a God who actually cared about me. He was just there allowing bad things to happen. And so I didn't really have a very good positive viewpoint of God.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people are turned off by that because they see the world and some of the, you know, the horrible calamities that take place in people's personal circumstances. They can be so horrible. And they sort of write God off as not being, if he's really a merciful God, how can he let these things happen? And, you know, and it's kind of an understandable argument. I mean, that's what we need pastors for, to kind of clear those things up. So how did you start feeling that call out of playing rock and roll music and maybe a new direction?
Well, during the 1990s, when my family and I, we moved to Georgia, that kind of really put an end to all of the music scene that I was experiencing up in West Virginia. I had kind of toyed and tried to do some projects down in Georgia. It didn't really develop. And so I was just content with just practicing guitar, just writing songs and these kind of things. It wasn't probably until around the mid to late 90s that my viewpoints on some of the music started to change. And it was really, again, as I said before, with my mother becoming a Christian, that was really the catalyst for really changing everything around, because when my wife, who actually, to backtrack, before we even got married, my wife would go to church with my mother, and you know, she was trying to do the whole brownie points with mom, try to get in with mom.
I was going to say, you know, your wife Mary, she knew how to play those strings, didn't she?
More than you know, anyway. But it was funny because my mother would ask my wife, Mary, she would say, "Why don't you come to church with us?" And my wife would say, "Yeah, well, okay, what time Sunday should we be there?" And she'd say, "No, it's Saturday morning." And she was like, "Oh, okay, it must be a special..."
Of course, it was Saturday morning because your mother was a Seventh-day
Adventist Christian, yes.
Now, what church was Mary brought up in, if she was?
She was baptized Lutheran, but she was never really a member of any church. She was just she'd go with her friends, and her parents allowed her to go to church and these kind of things like that. But she was never really committed to any one faith. And so when my mother invited her to come, she said, "Oh yeah, sure." And it was the first time she'd ever heard anyone going to church on Saturday. And
now,
she
how did she approach that? Did she think it was kind of strange, or did she want an explanation, or did she just say, "Okay, I'll come along"?
Well, she kind of thought it was like some type of special convention. You know, it must be some special gathering, you know. And so she went there that morning, and the church was full. She said, "Wow, there must be a lot of people at this special gathering," you know. And then, you know,
of course, the next week it was like another special gathering.
Well, at that time it was kind of a off and on kind of thing, but this is how God worked in our lives. She would come home, and she would say, "Hey, I heard about this Sabbath thing. What is it about this Sabbath thing?" And she would always tell me, "Now, if you can prove it from the Bible, then I'll believe it." Which is funny because neither one of us were even practicing Christians at all. You know, like it really mattered if it was in the Bible or not, you know. But she would always say that, if it's in the Bible, I'll believe it. I had not read a Bible in a long time. And so she came to me and asked, "What's this Sabbath thing?" I had no idea where it was. I was so biblically illiterate, it was really terrible. And we found a Bible in the house.
Let me ask you, were you raised in a church school, or did you go to a public school?
No, public school. Okay. Yeah, I had never been in a Christian school at all up until when I went to college. Yeah, so biblical illiteracy ran amok in our house at that time. But I still, the amazing thing is this. She came to me asking about this Sabbath question. I had no idea where it was in the Bible. I said, "It's in there somewhere." She said, "You got to show me." I opened the Bible, and I opened it straight to Exodus 20.
It's a miracle.
Right to it. And said, "Oh yeah, there it is." So she read it. "Oh, I never saw it before." And this happened with other topics and stuff as well. Whatever it was, she'd say, "Well, what about this?" I'd turn straight to it. I didn't know where it was. And I turned straight to it and say, "Wow." So God started to really move in our married life. And we were Christians still.
He was giving you miracle markers in your Bible.
Absolutely.
I mean, I teach a Bible marking class, and I can't do that.
It was an amazing thing.
So as you kept falling into the scriptures that you needed, were you going over other topics also?
We were. The funny thing is, she would be the one coming to me saying, "Where is this in the Bible?" And I would say, "I don't know." And she'd say, "Well, if it's in the Bible, I'll believe it," you know. And so I don't know where it's at. And I would turn to it every time. And
That's
Chuck,
wonderful.
I tell you, without fail, it was every time. I had no clue where it was. And she became very excited because she was learning a lot that she had never seen before. I was becoming excited because I was being basically recommitted to the scriptures that I remember hearing when I was really little. And I became like one of those disciples on the road to Emmaus. I started saying, "My heart is burning with this. You know, this is real stuff." And I'll never forget that one day we were home, we were in the bedroom, we were putting clothes away. And she was folding clothes, I was putting clothes in the closet. And I said, "Mary, I think I want to go back to church." Now, I thought I was going to hear something like,
now,
"What?"
about how long after she started going to church with your mother until this transition took place in you?
Well, that was in the early 90s before we got married. We got married in 1994. So that was we were still kind of seeing each other, and she was going to church with my mother off and on. But then when we moved to Georgia, we would come up and, you know, we would go, well, actually, she would go to church with my mother, and I would just kind of stay at home. I didn't really care to do any of that. So it was in 1999 that we...
So it took a few years.
Oh, yeah, I was hard-headed. God had to do some extra stuff on me.
That's something else we've got in common there.
Well, I hate to say that's the truth, but I thought that for sure she would say, "What? Are you going to church, you?" But it was silence. So I turned around. She was sitting on the bed. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were big. And she said, "I was thinking the exact same thing." And
Isn't that
so
something?
I had goosebumps. She had goosebumps. I called my mother up. She cried. She called the pastor down in Georgia. He invited us. And God started working upon us right at that point.
Wow. So this was about 1999.
Mm-hmm.
What a moment, man. That's something you never will forget right there.
Oh, no. It's embedded.
Now, at that point, how many children did you have?
We had two.
You had two children.
We had
then.
two. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what was the next step then? You just kind of started going to church. Were you working at that point?
I was working at a Target warehouse.
Okay.
Not a Target store, but an actual distribution center. They call them DCs, down in Georgia. And God knew a lot more of what he was doing than I understood at the time. And I believe now, though, that he placed me there in Target to learn the gospel truth, because all of my friends that I'd made there, they were pastors of other denominations.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, so
just a lot of pastors working at that Target distribution center.
And as you can imagine, when you're a baby Christian and they find out you're a baby Christian of a faith that's different than theirs, they like to hammer you and have trivia and questions. And
Yes.
and Chuck, the reason why I got to know the Bible so well was because I would say, I'm not sure about that. Let me go home and study it, and I'll bring back an answer. And I would always go home, ask God to show me, and God, without fail, always showed me the next revelation in truth, and I was able to come back and share that with them. And almost every single time they would say, I never saw it that way before. And I realized it wasn't because I was smart, it was because I was letting the Holy Spirit work through me.
Wow, which is so much better than smart.
Much better than smart. This wouldn't work with me. I'm not smart enough to come up with the good stuff.
I feel the same way about myself. Wow. So here you are working at the distribution center. You've got all these pastors asking you questions. You're coming up with the answers. So what was the next step for you?
Well, it was probably late 2000, early 2001 when I started getting the feeling that God was pushing me on to something else. Something, I shouldn't say else, something more. And I didn't know what it was at the time. So the church that I was a member of, I asked, and here's a funny story. I asked our elder, one of our elders, I said, I think that God's leading me into pastoral ministry, but I'm not sure. And he said, and walked away. And I said, what's mean,
Yeah.
So about a week later, I asked my pastor. I said, well, I'll ask him, man of God, Pastor, I've really been thinking that God's leading me into pastoral ministry. He said, and walked away. I said, well, I got a what's going on here, And so about 2 months later, the elder friend of mine came back and said, you still feel like you're being moved to go into ministry? I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, all right, December 3rd. I said, December 3rd, what is that? He said, I want you to preach for me in my spot. I said, whoa, now that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not saying that. He said, no, let's see what gifts God's given you. Now, I never thought about spiritual gifts at that time, but it's because of people like that, of godly people like that, that have shown me that it's better to rely on God and what he supplies us with than what we think we have to give in service.
So here you've got a sermon to prepare for now, your first one in your life. Did you have the EBGBs about doing that?
Terribly so.
Here you've been a rock and roll player, heavy metal band all your life, and now you're getting nervous about getting up and preaching a little sermon on Sabbath morning?
Yeah. I had a guitar. I would always tell my wife, well, I had a guitar to hide behind then, Now I have a pulpit, but every eye's on you, But
Now, do you remember what that first sermon was?
I don't. It was complete. I was so terrified when I first got up there. I had 2 pages of notes, and the notes were shaking like this, and it was funny. It was funny to look back. They taped it. I don't know where that tape is at now, but it was funny to see it.
That would be great. I wish I would get to see that one. Maybe I will get to see that one of these days.
Maybe so.
Maybe we'll have a nice panoramic playback in heaven at some point.
Possibly so.
That. Okay, so you do your first sermon. So was it well received?
I thought it was a disaster. I felt so dejected. I felt so horrible, and oh Lord, I just know I've let you down. I am so sorry. And I just remember going back to the back of the church, and people were shaking my hand, and you hear the same, good sermon, and you hear that all the time. But there was one little lady who came up, and she said, Wayne, I want you to know I needed to hear that today. Thank you so much for being used by God.
Amen. Thank God for little old ladies.
Absolutely. And I thought right at that point, and this has been my motto, Chuck, ever since, if God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through me. That's the way I look at it.
Wow. And that's powerful. So then how long was it before you made the decision to go ahead and go to school to become a pastor?
I wrestled with it for a few years, actually. My wife continued to, are you sure? Members of our church, are you sure? And
So how did your wife feel about being married to a pastor?
I don't think she was too crazy about it at first, to tell you the truth. Just being Christians was a huge culture shock from where we were. And once we started to really see the lifestyle of a pastor, it's a thankless job. And, you always put yourself out for other people, and you're not really able to reap the benefits of seeing the transformations in people's lives. And she said, are you really sure you want to do this? And I said, I'm not sure. I said, but if it's what God wants me to do, I've got to. So,
that can be discouraging just to your average Joe Christian like me, that, you try to help people, and, you have a Bible study, or you hand them a DVD or a book or something, and you don't always get to see the end result. But, when you do, it's such a sweet thing. So
it really is.
So, okay, so you guys, you struggled a little bit with that, but then how did you finally decide? Did you have a big prayer session, or?
Well, I'll tell you what. To backtrack just a bit, before my wife and I started seeing each other, and I have to say this because it happened again. Some people say that they've heard the audible voice of God, and some people will say, if you really think that, you're nuts. And I've run into both. I was a very depressed teenager. I was actually suicidal towards the end of my teens, and one night I had hurt a muscle in my back. And I had pain pills as well as muscle relaxers. And I just finally I was tired of living life, and I was miserable. I hated life. I hated people. I hated everything about, living. And so I emptied the whole pill bottle into my hands, and I got this close, and I heard the audible voice of God. And when people say, what did it sound like? It wasn't so much of what it sounded. It was almost as if I could see the words as I could hear them. And it wasn't a long, elaborate theological treatise, It was simply God saying, Wayne, put this off. Don't do this. And I thought about it. I put them away. Well, that was in 1991 or 1992. Now you're asking me about how I knew to go into ministry. I had started to try to do the terrible thing of being presumptuous. I started trying to get myself into school. I started trying to do this. I started taking the place of God, and all the doors were closed. And I remember one day in Target yelling at God saying, Lord, why would you want me to do all these things? Tell me you want me to do these things, and then shut all the doors. What do you want from me? And it was silence. So I said, maybe this call was completely wrong. Maybe I just thought I was supposed to go into ministry. And the more I thought about it, yeah, that's what it was. So I said, I'm done with this. No more. And as soon as I had thought that thought, he said, Wayne, I want you at Southern Adventist University next year. And I looked around. Was that really him? And I remember reading in Scripture that only God knows the heart. Now, Satan can make calculated guesses based on what you do and your lifestyle, and he's pretty smart in those regards, but he can't read the mind. And so I started asking God mentally, well, what about this? What about this? How am I going to pay for it? What am I going to do here? And every question, not only did he bring an answer, but he reminded me of who had said that answer in my past. And finally, I was questioned out, and I said, Lord, if this is what you want me to do, I'm yours. And from that point on, that's when all the doors opened up.
Wow, what a testimony, man. So you ended up going to Southern, and now how long were you there?
I was there for 4 years, from 2004 to 2008.
Wow. I mean, you took a little while in deciding to finally go. Now, how old were you when you started? Going to Southern.
I was 32, which made me think that I was one of the old guys. At 32, I was one of the old guys. And I thought, this is bad. I have a lot of 18-year-old kids around me. I'm almost twice as old as they are. And I thought, this is bad. And I really struggle with that. But for the most part, they kind of treated me as their much, much older brother. So I was okay with that.
Did your whole family move there?
We did. At first, it was just me. And we made this is part of the struggles that God was leading us through to really helped to galvanize our faith in him. I was at Southern probably for almost the first whole semester by myself without my wife and children there, and it was really rough. They would come on the weekends, and then they'd leave Sunday night. So there was a lot of searching, a lot of faith searching, a lot of, do I really want this? Is this really what I believe God is wanting me to do? And what proved it to me was the fact that I was willing to do whatever it took to be a servant of God. And that's how I've always been since.
Isn't that something? We've got a couple of minutes left, so why don't you tell us what the transition was from after you got out of school, and what landed you where you're at today?
Well, I got at Southern Adventist University in your senior year. If you're in the theology department, conferences come and they'll interview you to see if they want to hire you for the conference. I interviewed with Georgia Cumberland. I had interviewed with Carolina. I interviewed with Florida. I interviewed with Kentucky, Tennessee, and I really didn't know where I was going to be at. And
I'm sure you were praying through all that.
Oh yes, very much so. And so I was in class one day, and Star Stevens, who still works at Southern Adventist University, she came and interrupted class and told me, "You get a phone call," and I ran, and it was Kentucky, Tennessee, which is the conference I work for right now. And they said, "We want you to be with us." And I said, "Are you sure?" And they said, "Oh yes." So I asked them if I could have some time to pray about it, and they said yes. The next day I came back and I said, "If you still want me, I'll be yours." And from that point on, they helped me to go to seminary, and I've been part of Kentucky, Tennessee ever since. That was in 2008.
2008. So when did you move to the Nashville area?
In the summer of 2011.
Well, you know what, man, this has just been a wonderful just history of your life and leading right up to where you're at today, which of course is the pastor of the Boulevard Seventh-day Adventist Church and at the Lebanon Seventh-day Adventist Church. Wayne, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show on Eternity Now, just to share your life story, coming from being a heavy metal rocker to being a Seventh-day Adventist preacher. And I can tell you, man, you're anything but stodgy, brother. I really, really have enjoyed this.
I appreciate that.
Will you come back again sometime?
Absolutely.
I hope you do. Thank you so much for being here on Eternity Now with Pastor Wayne Long. He's the pastor at both the Lebanon and the Old Hickory Boulevard Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Nashville area. I hope you come back again sometime. God bless you.